Chapters 13 and 14 from George Ivanovich Gurdjieff's Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson. Why, in man's reason, fantasy may be perceived as reality. My dear and kind grandfather, will you please explain to me, if only in a general way, why is it that the beings on the planet Earth take the ephemeral for the real? To this question of his grandson, Beelzebub replied, on the planet Earth, this particularity in the psyche of the three-brained beings arose only during later periods, and it arose only because their predominant part, formed in them as in all three-brained beings, gradually allowed the other parts of their total presence to perceive every new impression without fulfilling what is called being part dole duty. That is to say, merely as such impressions are generally perceived by one or another of their independent localizations, known as being centers. Or to put it in their language, they believe everything anybody says, instead of believing only what they have been able to verify by their own sane deliberation. In other words, only those convictions they have reached as a result of confronting and evaluating the data already deposited in them, which have given rise to different conceptions in each of their localizations of diverse nature. In general, a new conception is crystallized in the presences of these strange beings only if Mr. Smith speaks of somebody or something in a certain way. Then, if Mr. Brown says the same, the hearer is quite convinced that it is just so, and could not possibly be otherwise. Thanks to this particularity of their psyche, most of the beings there, having heard the writer I spoke of praised so highly, are at present quite convinced that he is a very great psychologist, with an incomparable knowledge of the psyche of the beings of his planet. As a matter of fact, when I was on that planet for the last time, and having heard of this writer, once went to see him myself on quite another matter, I found him, according to my understanding, just like all the other contemporary writers there, that is, extremely limited, or as our dear Mullah Nasser-ad-Din would say, unable to see further than his nose. As regards any knowledge of the real psyche of the beings of his planet, in actual conditions, he might safely be called a complete ignoramus. I repeat, the story of this writer shows in a very characteristic way to what extent the three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, particularly the contemporary ones, fail to fulfill being park dole duty, and how there are never crystallized in them any subjective being convictions formed by their own logical deliberations, as in general is proper to three-brained beings. But instead, only those convictions are crystallized that depend exclusively upon the opinions of others. And it was only because they failed to fulfill being park dole duty, which alone enables a being to become aware of genuine reality, that they saw in this writer some perfection or other that was not there. This strange trait of their psyche, that of being satisfied with whatever Smith or Brown says without trying to know more, became rooted in them long ago, and now they no longer make the least effort to know anything that can be understood, solely by their own active reflection. It must be said here that the blame for this lies neither in the organ Kundabuffer, which was implanted in their ancestors, nor in its consequences, which were crystallized in them because of a mistake on the part of certain sacred individuals, and which later began to pass by heredity from generation to generation. No, they themselves are to blame for it, on account of the abnormal conditions of external, ordinary being existence they gradually established, and which have progressively fostered in their common presence what has now become their inner evil god, called self-calming. But you will understand all this very well for yourself later on when I give you, as I promised, more information about the planet that has taken your fancy. In any case, I strongly advise you to be most careful in the future when you refer to the three-brained beings of that planet, not to offend them in any way. Otherwise, as they say, with what may the devil not joke? They might hear about your insulting them, and to use another of their expressions, lay you by the heels. There is no harm in recalling here another wise saying of our dear Mullah Nasir ad-Din. What on earth will happen next? A flea might swallow an elephant. Beelzebub was about to say something more, but at that moment a ship's attendant entered and handed him an etheragram in his name. When Beelzebub had finished listening to the contents of the etheragram, and the attendant had gone, Hassin turned to him and said, Dear grandfather, please go on and tell me more about the three-centered beings arising and existing on that interesting planet called Earth. Beelzebub, looking at his grandson once again with a particular smile, made a strange gesture with his head, and continued. Introducing a perspective that promises nothing very cheerful. I must tell you that in the beginning, the beings on that planet had the same presence as those of all the Kes Chap Martinin, three-brained beings arising on all the corresponding planets of the whole of our great universe, and that they also had the same duration of existence as all other three-brained beings. The various changes in their presence began for the most part after the second misfortune had occurred to this ill-fated planet, during which its chief continent, existing under the name of Atlantis, entered within the planet. From that time on, they created all sorts of conditions of external being existence that caused the quality of their radiations to go steadily from bad to worse. And great nature was thus compelled gradually to transform their common presence through various compromises and changes in order to regulate the quality of the vibrations they radiated, which were required chiefly to preserve the being welfare of the former fragments of their planet. For the same reason, great nature gradually increased the number of beings there to such an extent that they are now breeding on all the lands of that planet. The exterior forms of their planetary bodies are all much alike, and of course in respect of size and their other subjective characteristics, each of them is coded, just as we are, in accordance with heredity, with the conditions existing at the moment of conception, and with the other factors that serve in general as causes for the arising and formation of every being. They also differ among themselves in the color of their skin and in the type of hair they have, and these characteristics of their presence are determined, as everywhere else, by the effects of that part of the surface of their planet where they arise and are formed until they reach responsible age, or as they say, become adult. As for their psyche, its fundamental traits have precisely the same peculiarities in all of them, no matter where they arise, and among these is that special property, thanks to which only on that strange planet, in the whole of the universe, does there occur the horrible process called the process of the destruction of each other's existence, or as they call it on that ill-fated planet, war. Besides this chief particularity of their common psyche, certain properties in each of them, regardless of where they arise and exist, are completely crystallized and become an integral part of their common presence, properties that exist under the names of egoism, self-love, vanity, pride, conceit, credulity, suggestibility, and many others no less abnormal and unbecoming to the essence of any three-brained being whatsoever. Of these abnormal properties, the most terrible one for them is suggestibility. Sometime I will tell you specially about this extremely strange property of their psyche. Having said this, Beelzebub became thoughtful, this time for longer than usual. Then, turning again to his grandson, he said, I see that the three-brained beings arising and existing on the peculiar planet called Earth interest you very much, and as during our voyage on the ship Karnak, We shall have to talk about many things to while away the time. I shall tell you all I can about them. To give you a clear understanding of the strangeness of their psyche, it will be best if I tell you about my descents in person to the planet Earth, in the order in which they took place, and about the events that occurred there of which I myself was a witness. I personally visited the surface of the planet Earth 6 times, and each of these visits was brought about by a different set of circumstances. I shall begin with my first descent.